getting together back in the creation of the Protection Island Aquatic Reserve. Uh, there were several community meetings where they asked people to contribute their knowledge about the aquatic reserve and what's there. And various people put notes on a big map about where we thought there were birds and where we thought there were mammals and other things in the aquatic reserve. But uh, to be honest, it was not very complete. And we felt like we needed more information, particularly about the birds and the mammals that we could see out in the aquatic reserve. I had a background in seabird surveys, and so I thought, wow, wouldn't it be great if we can get out there and actually look at these birds out on the water? But the thing that we were missing at the time was a boat. And so if you go to the next slide, we had this incredible volunteer who stepped forward, Ross Anderson, who lives at Cape George on the west side of the Miller Peninsula near Port Townsend. And he has this lovely boat, Sea Hardy, with a flying bridge. If you go to the next slide, and actually, the next slide shows two other people who are very instrumental in this project, Betsy Carlson, who's also on the line, and Betty Bookheim, who I guess is retired now. But these are people who are really encouraging. Betsy took care of all the groundwork from the Port Townsend Marine Science Center, and it was great for me because I could just kind of, put this together and go along on these rides and look at birds and mammals and have a great time out in the water. So I appreciate and really thank everybody else for their time and efforts. So if you go to the next slide. So here's the boat. It's kind of like this small cruiser. Ross has had this boat for a long time, and Ross is the sort of person that really likes using his boat for intellectual pursuits. He helps the researchers out going back and forth to Protection Island, who work with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service out there. And he was very interested in having his boat used on this project. So we did 59 total surveys. And I think we used Ross and his boat on 57 out of the 59. So it was really, really nice. And you go to the next slide. So the really great thing about this boat is it has a flying bridge. So we could be up on the top, looking out, looking ahead of the boat. We designed our surveys. If you know, there's basically two kinds of surveys you can do of marine birds. One is a strip transect and the other is a line transect. The people who are doing like marble murrelet surveys and other single species surveys oftentimes use a line transect, which may be more beneficial for statistical analysis. But we purposefully wanted to look at the entire community of seabirds that were in the aquatic reserve. And so we used a strip transect where we were counting out 200 meters on one side of the boat. If you go to the next slide. Oh, well, this is just our mission. So we wanted to be more complete about what were the birds and the mammals that are using the aquatic reserve and trying to quantify over time what areas of the reserve are being used. So basically, we're looking at when are the birds there, where are the birds when they're in the aquatic reserve, maybe some ideas about why they're there, if we could figure out what was going on, their behaviors in different areas. So we designed the studies. It was just a simple study. Go to the next slide, where we would ride on the flying bridge and count birds. So as it says there, we did 59 surveys. We had to change our route partway through the survey, through the study. We found we went too far north in the aquatic reserve and ended up in the traffic lanes. And so on several surveys, we had to either stop or change our route because there was a freighter coming. Sometimes there were submarines coming at us. The Coast Guard would run into us and say, hey, you have to be more than 1,000 meters away or 1,000 yards away from the submarine. And so we switched routes and changed it a little bit. But we were always counting at 200 meters on one side of the boat, depending upon the side of the boat, depending upon the visibility, the glare. We wanted to do this in a fairly short period of time, so we designed a survey that took about 4 hours from Cape George. So we could go out in the morning, be back about midday. Typically, Sea Hardy, wonderful Sea Hardy, could go pretty comfortable 7 knots. if the current was with us, we might go 8. If the current wasn't with us, we would go about 6. And so we were, this is not a fast boat. And so actually that's good for observing birds. So it worked out very well. And like I said, we observed 57 bird species and 8 marine mammal species during our surveys. I'm just talking about the birds here today. But if you go on to the next slide. Here is our route. Just to give you an idea where you are, and you can see in the far lower left corner is the town of Sequim. And if you go to the east from Sequim, first there's Sequim Bay, which is the southwest corner of the Aquatic Reserve. The Aquatic Reserve is the green portion there. And so the far southwest corner is at the mouth of Sequim Bay. Discovery Bay and Diamond Point, Cape George are in the middle there. And then Port Townsend is around the corner to the east outside the map. So our route, we had 6 legs on the route. You can see the legs there, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We often did a circumnavigation of the island in the middle of our surveys. We were doing a separate study counting eagles on the island and counting harbor seals hauled out on the island. But we were trying to survey different areas of the aquatic reserve, get an idea where the birds were concentrated and which birds were where, when. So next slide. Here's just an example of one of our data sheets. This was during the middle of surveys in March of 2018. And you can see the list of species, the species codes, the 4-letter codes that we use for birds, the number, the zone that they were in, their behavior, whether they're swimming, flying, the location. And then we computerized all this and we have the data available. And that's what I'm cranking through right now. So next slide. So some of the questions that we had when we first started this was, Protection Island is the largest seabird nesting colony in the Salish Sea. The last good estimate by Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife Service, or Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, is there was approximately 36,000 breeding pairs of rhinoceros use the island. So there's 72,000 birds right there. Plus, that's just breeding population. There's other floaters, there's non-breeders. So there could be maybe 80 to 100,000 rhinoceros auklets involved with this island. There's nesting glaucous-winged gulls, there's nesting pigeon guillemots. And so our question was, our first hypothesis was, hey, this is the largest nesting colony in the Salish Sea. The birds are nesting in, say, April through July, through August. So that's when we should see the most birds in the aquatic reserve. Well, if you look at this graph, you see the exact opposite was true. The breeding season was actually when we saw the least density of birds on our transects. So during the breeding season, April through July, we'd see rhinoceros auklets, but they are mobile birds, they're flying. And so it turns out rhinoceros auklets can easily fly, say, to the San Juan Islands, to Harrow Strait. They can fly down the Strait of Juan de Fuca, beyond Port Angeles. They can fly into Puget Sound, to feed in Admiralty Inlet. So they're not restricted to just staying within the aquatic reserve. The time of year when we had the highest densities of birds, interestingly, was after the nesting season in August and September, when we had this huge influx of birds coming from other nesting areas. And 2 species in particular that contributed to those peaks in August and September were common murres and California gulls. And I'll talk about them here in a second. You can see the picture there. Rhinoceros in that group on the top, the population is not doing well. There's probably down to maybe 5 to 10 pairs, I would guess, left using the island. But you can see kind of the general trend of the annual cycle of birds that use the aquatic reserve. Low point during the nesting season, high point during the late fall or late summer and early fall migration. You see there's a peak in December, another peak that shows up there. And that, I believe, is largely due to diving ducks. In November, December, we start getting big influx of scoters, long-tailed ducks that occupy some of the other areas of the aquatic reserve. Okay, next slide. Another question is, how many species would we observe on these surveys? This is a graph that just shows the number of species per month, the average for each month. And you see, once again, I guess this is expected. In the nesting season, the only birds that are using the aquatic reserve are those species that nest nearby, other than a few maybe pre-breeders that don't migrate away during the nesting season. During the fall, winter, and spring, we had pretty consistent numbers of these birds that are spending the winter in the aquatic reserve. So the various species of waterfowl, loons, grebes, and other species that spend the winter there. So next slide. The 10 most abundant species that we observed on our transects. This was particularly interesting for me. You notice in the column there on the left, the ones with an asterisk are the ones that nest on Protection Island. So pigeon guillemot, rhinoceros auklet, glaucous-winged gull are the three largest nesting populations on the island. But common murre ended up being the most abundant species that we record or that we observed on our surveys. And that's largely because of this huge migration of common murres after their nesting season. The closest nesting colony of common murres is Tatoosh Island, right at the mouth of the Strait of Juan de Fuca. But we have so many murres that show up in the eastern Strait of Juan de Fuca, they must be coming from colonies outside Washington State. There are large colonies in Oregon, so those birds are traveling into the Strait of Juan de Fuca, migrating through. Anybody who's offshore in the eastern Strait of Juan de Fuca during the late summer and fall sees lots of common murres there. So they ended up being the most abundant bird. The interesting thing about common murres is their chicks jump off the cliffs when they're only about maybe a third to a half the size of the adults. The chicks can't fly. At the same time, the father goes to sea with the chick. The adults at the same time go through a wing molt where they lose the ability to fly. And these murres, the father chick pairs plus the other murres, swim from their nesting colonies all the way into the eastern Strait of Juan de Fuca, several hundred miles. They migrate by swimming. So you see these murres during the late summer and fall, they're not flying. There are no flying murres out there. They're all just swimming in these giant regattas or big fleets that are coming through into the eastern Strait of Juan de Fuca. So you can see the other species there: surf scoter, one of the diving ducks, California gull. I'll talk about them in a second here. Ancient murrelet. This is a very interesting story. Ancient murrelets are only here during the winter, typically in December through January. They're a species that nests in the North Pacific. They have a very interesting history. They may fly north after nesting, go all the way up to the Bering and Chukchi Seas. After being up there for a month or two, they may fly all the way back down here and spend the winter in the eastern Strait of Juan de Fuca. So you'll see lots of them in Admiralty Inlet and lots in the Protection Island Aquatic Reserve. And then other species there, long-tailed duck and white-winged scoter, which are other diving ducks, and Pacific loon, probably the most social loon that we have here. So, okay, and you look at the second column, the percent of surveys observed. So only two of the species were observed on 100% of the surveys. So pigeon guillemot and glaucous-winged gull. These are birds that nest on Protection Island and they stay in the aquatic reserve. They stay in that area during the wintertime. Rhinoceros auklets mostly leave. So there's a period of time when we don't see rhinoceros auklets. Common murres, what's interesting about them is even though they don't nest in the aquatic reserve, they're there nearly all the time. So, okay, next slide. This is looking at where the birds were in the aquatic reserve. You remember the 6 legs that we do? And it turns out the western side of the aquatic reserve has the highest densities of birds. And coincidentally, this is also an area that on a lot of the DNR maps and the WDFW maps show a herring holding area. We've had herring spawn between Dungeness Bay and Protection Island And I think that one of the reasons that, obviously, the reason that the birds are concentrating in leg two is because of higher concentrations of forage fish in that area. And you heard Bertie say there's discussion about enlarging sections of the Protection Island Aquatic Reserve. And I would hope that one of those enlargements is off to the west, because even though there's this artificial boundary between the aquatic reserve and whatever is out to the west, the birds don't see that boundary. So there's lots of bird activity out to the west towards Dungeness Bay at the same time as in the aquatic reserve. Leg five, leg five has the lowest density, and that's off to the east of Protection Islands. It's fairly deep water. It seems like there's not much bottom relief there, and it showed less activity as far as the birds go. The most abundant species by month was particularly interesting. All alcids. If you know the family Alcidae, it's the auks. And so January is the month when ancient murrelet was the most abundant species, the ones that migrate here just for the winter. During the spring, pigeon guillemots, or the late winter, pigeon guillemots are most abundant. Nesting season, when all the rhinoceros auklets are around, they're the most abundant. And then in the fall and early winter, common murres are the most abundant. So through the year, all the alcids were contributing their share to the birds of the aquatic reserve. Next. There's a couple of graphs here that show a little bit about the annual cycle of these different birds. So this is looking at kind of the average density of three alcid species during the year. So months across the bottom, densities across on the y-axis. And so if you look at common myrrh, the blue lines, notice there's not a whole lot of density of them during the nesting season from, say, April through July. But then this huge input of common murres in August and September as they swamp the system. They become a big member of feeding flocks. Lots of murres swimming around in the eastern Strait of Juan de Fuca during that time. The red lines for pigeon guillemot. Uh, Interestingly enough, even though they nest on Protection Island, their numbers seemed to be lower during the breeding season, May, June, and July. Partly that's because if they're nesting, one member of each pair is on the nest when they're incubating eggs. So it may be that those birds are disappearing, or they may be flying outside the aquatic reserve or going someplace that we're not seeing them. And then finally, rhinoceros auklet, the green lines are the large nesting colony on Protection Island, and they show up real well here during the nesting season. Okay, next slide. Now, this is one I'm particularly proud of. This is the annual cycle of the gulls that we saw on our surveys. Most of the seabird surveys in the Salish Sea have pretty much ignored gulls. They don't separate the different gull species. And one of our missions was to try to quantify the input of the passage of different gulls through the aquatic reserve and by proxy the Salish Sea. And it turns out we are in this great place where the eastern Strait of Juan de Fuca is like a crossroads for gull migration in in this area. If you look at the list here, Heermann's gull is a bird that mostly nests in Mexico. The largest colonies are in the Gulf of California. They appear here after their nesting season. They nest mostly like January through June. We start seeing them. They're the red line, the red column. And so they reach their peak in September and October. Then they quickly disappear. They go back south. Short-billed gull is coming from the opposite direction. Short-billed gull is the green line. Short-billed gull, formerly mew gull, they mostly nest in taiga forests in Canada and Alaska. So they're nesting to the north. They're traveling down here for the winter. And so you notice the green line extends November, December, January, February, fairly low line. And then go to the pink lines, the glaucous wing gull, which has higher numbers during the non-breeding season. And I think that's because we get an input of glaucous wing gulls from further north during the wintertime. They come all the way down from Alaska to spend the winter here. And then finally, the one that I'm so happy with is this incredible graph of California gull numbers. We have one of the most unappreciated migrations through the Salish Sea is the California gull migration. California gulls nest in the interior of North America. Their largest colonies are like in Alberta. They fly over the mountains, they come down the rivers like the Fraser River and the Columbia River. The first saltwater they get to after nesting is the Salish Sea. And here they hang out for a while. We have tens of thousands of California gulls that move through the Salish Sea. By the time we get to Christmas time and our Christmas counts, we're lucky to see 5 of them. They totally disappear. They go south. And so you can see the black line there for California gull. We have this huge number, far outnumbering all the other gulls in August and September. And so that's this wave of California gulls that are migrating by. Okay, next. Okay, and now Austin. We have this great chance to hear from Austin. I met Austin at a meeting at the Dungeness River Nature Center not too long ago, and I was so excited that they have a quantitative analysis person on the staff now. And so we gave him some data, and we have a lot more data to give him. And he came up with some really intriguing analyses that he's going to present here today. So thank you, Austin.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Bob. Erica, can you hear me? Can everyone hear me, I guess? Is the real question? Awesome. Yeah, so I think as you can tell, this is a really unique data set that's been collected. I was really excited about it when Bob walked up to me up in Squim at that meeting and said, hey, I have some data, do you want to take a stab at it? And I'm looking forward to continuing to kind of work on this. So among all the species that Bob just talked about, I'm going to focus in on 4 of them in particular. And I was not around when this was established, but essentially there are 4 species that were selected by the Puget Sound Partnership as kind of broad indicators of recovery in Puget Sound. And, you can, I think, litigate whether or not they picked the right species. And I'm sure there's differences of opinion there, but nonetheless, these are 4 species that not only were selected by PSP, but also occur in this data set that Bob and others collected. So kind of my goal working with Bob was to provide analysis support and to try and identify here as a program areas within Protection Island Aquatic Reserve that are most used by these indicator species. Oh, sorry, next slide, please. I just hit my button thinking I had control. So really there are 3 questions that we tried to get to with this kind of secondary analysis. First is which species vary seasonally within the reserve and which species tend to co-occur. And I think Bob just gave you actually a really in-depth view, much more in-depth than what we're about to do here. And then second is have any of these kind of indicator species that we just talked about, those 4, have any of them really seen substantial change over time, over the time period that this data was collected? And then third was where within the reserve do these indicator species tend to occur most? Are there areas that they tend to avoid? With the idea that that might help our program really start to target some of our monitoring to understand what might be happening in those areas. Kind of like what Bob alluded to, like why are these birds in certain areas or avoiding certain areas of the reserve? Next slide. Okay, so this is kind of building on top of what Bob just mentioned, and Erica put nice little pictures next to the abbreviated names of these different species. So in the top left of this plot, we have marbled murrelet. On the top right, we have pigeon guillemot. Rhinoceros auklet in the bottom left, and in the lower right, we have surf scoter, those diving ducks that Bob mentioned. So one of the things that I did on Bob's data was I ran a multi-level pattern analysis, and this was done on daily aggregate counts. And essentially what we see is that not only are there certain species that occur in certain seasons, but there are also species that, kind of like what Bob just showed in his plots, that tend to occur, or at least were counted more in clusters of seasons, if you will. So generally, there were 3 species of birds. This is across all species, by the way, not just the 4 indicator species. But so among the all the species. I think Bob said 57 in total that were in this data set. 3 of them were significantly associated only with fall. That doesn't mean that they're not there in other months. They might be, as Bob mentioned, nesting. That's kind of an important asterisk on all of this. In the wintertime, there were 8 species, including those marble murrelet, so they are most likely to be observed on these surveys in the wintertime. Spring, there were 2 species. Summer, there were actually no species in this data set that were specifically associated with summer. Fall and summer together, kind of late summer going into fall, essentially, they were 2 goal species. Fall and winter is where we see surf scoters and pigeon guillemot being most observed, and we'll get to that in a minute. And then spring and summer was when we tended to see rhinoceros auklet most represented in the data that they collected out in the field. And then there were 5 species that tended to bridge fall, spring, and winter, kind of your species that are not quite year-round residents, but coming up on it. Next slide. So what I want to focus on now is, since Bob got into very much a lot of the seasonality a second ago, is really like, are we seeing sustained changes in any of these species within the reserve? Understanding that, of course, some of them leave. They also have periods of time, certain months of the year, when they are less likely to be observed, as Bob mentioned, because half of each breeding pair might be on the island itself, nesting. And so I guess I'll just summarize. Essentially, according to WDFW, in Puget Sound, pigeon guillemot are relatively stable, whereas surf scoter are in persistent decline across Puget Sound. And that is kind of why these 2 species are among these 4 indicator species, is you have some that are stable and some that are declining. And there's also an important caveat here that with all of this data, we're talking about one area within Puget Sound. So just because we see patterns in this particular reserve does not necessarily mean that those are indicative of what is happening across Puget Sound, but nonetheless, it's important to us because it does tell us what's happening in the reserve. So for marbled murrelet, we really do see these kind of incredible jumps in abundance, and they are really episodic. The birds might show up at certain times of every year, but they certainly do not show up with very much consistency in terms of their overall abundance during those times of year. So, for example, in 2021, I guess you can't really see my cursor, but in 2021, if Erica can hover over that, there was a little bit to the right, 2021. That really big spike. Yeah. So there was a huge spike in 2021 of these marbled murrelets showing up. But of course, they're also generally quite rare. And so a huge spike is still, 75 birds being observed at one point. So generally speaking, good news or not, they're already rare birds. Is that we don't see very much decline in marbled murrelet within the reserve. That doesn't mean we shouldn't be concerned. They are still rare birds, experiencing a lot of impacts, but generally speaking, they're not in decline. And that is in pretty stark contrast to what we're seeing for pigeon guillemot within the reserve. So across this data set, and you can see not only seasonal variability, and you can also see that, for example, pigeon guillemot do tend to always be observed, albeit, like Bob mentioned, in lower abundance during the nesting season. But essentially what you are seeing with that red dotted line is that the long-term trend within this data set, within the reserve, is one of decline for pigeon guillemot. So while they might be relatively stable across Puget Sound, kind of writ large, in the reserve, they do not appear to be stable. And so that is something that our program is starting to think about. And obviously with local partners there, are looking at ways of possibly trying to address into the future. The flip side to that is rhinoceros auklet and surf scoter. So rhinoceros auklet do follow kind of a similar pattern to frankly every other bird here except for pigeon guillemot in terms of these indicator species, in that they have those kind of episodic bursts in abundance that tend to happen at certain times of the year. And generally speaking, the abundance that we're seeing when those bursts occur, when they are present in the reserve, they are generally increasing in the reserve. And so it does appear that the reserve is at least spatially constrained to the reserve, is a good habitat for them, and that they are increasing year over year. And then another species for surf scoter, these are those diving ducks that Bob mentioned. Generally speaking, surf scoter are in pretty persistent decline across Puget Sound more broadly, and that is why they are selected as one of these indicator species and one that needs a lot of attention. But within Protection Island Aquatic Reserve, they generally are not declining, which I think is good news. Obviously we have work to do with Pigeon Guillemot, and other groups do as well who help manage the reserve and the birds inside of it. But unlike Pigeon Guillemot that are declining, surf scoters seem to be relatively stable. The one thing, and maybe just as a scientist, I love to put caveats on results from data, is that surf scoter are already in decline. And so we could really just be seeing a pattern here where we have already essentially reached a lower limit for this population. And, they are essentially up against a threshold where we're essentially waiting for there to be enough impact for them to kind of reach a tipping point. I hope that that's not the case, but it is something to kind of think about when you look at this data. So generally, surf scoter within the reserve they're not increasing, but they are stable, albeit possibly at low abundances than we would expect for them. On the next slide, there we go. So as Bob kind of mentioned, one of the really interesting questions about this data, and I think it really shows all of the data that they collected and how useful their sampling strategy was to try and understand where within the reserve these different species tend to occur. And again, we're only looking at 4. There are many more species and patterns that we can dig out of this data set. But generally speaking, what you see on the right, this is called a principal coordinate analysis. And on the y-axis is latitude, on the x-axis is longitude. And this is it's not a statistic. There's no statistical significance associated with this. All we're really doing is plotting the observations of these birds across the entire data set and where they tend to occur. Maybe Erica, if you could show with your cursor roughly where Protection Island is, it's pretty much, yeah, right around there. And so each one of these different colored dots, these are different species. Again, same order as before for all 4 of them. And then the size of the dot indicates in that single observation, which could be, at a given point in time on a given day, how many of each of these species were observed. So these are not daily averages or anything like that. But the general results that we're seeing here, and we're going to get into a little bit more nuance on this in a second, is that, as we know, marbled murrelets are quite rare, but when they are observed, they tend to be observed pretty evenly across the entire reserve. So those are those red dots that you see. There are a couple areas on the northeast side that they maybe tend to avoid, but of course, these are also rare birds. We're dealing with fairly low numbers of observations to begin with. Down below that in the blue dots, rhinoceros auklet are not only abundant, but they're also really cosmopolitan. We tend to see them quite evenly distributed across the reserve. And then what I think is quite interesting about these 4 species in particular is that Pigeon Guillemot and Surf Scoter really are polar opposites from those rhinoceros auklet. They are not evenly distributed at all across the reserve. They show very clear preferences for different areas of the reserve. So Pigeon Guillemot in particular, and we'll show this in more detail in a second, really seem to favor shallow habitats. And Surf Scoter also really seem to favor shallow habitats, but especially habitats that are to the west and immediately to the north of Protection Island. And this is essentially Dallas Bank that we're talking about. That is really important habitat for surf scoter. So on the next slide, also at the end of this presentation, I think we'll have time for questions in case there are any, either for myself or for Bob, about everything you're seeing. So we just looked at kind of a map, right? And that map it's not really a statistical test. It certainly is not any sort of predictive model of where you would see certain birds in the reserve. But what you are seeing here is a predictive model of where we expect to see these 4 indicator species within the reserve. And hopefully on your screens, you can see this clearly. Essentially, this might look like a topographic map or a contour map, but it's actually the output of what's called a generalized additive model or a GAM. And what a GAM allows you to do is, unlike a regular model that assumes a linear fit to your data, which can be tricky with any sort of natural real world data, a generalized additive model allows us to assume some nonlinearity in the response. Essentially, spatially, in this case, it allows us to have curvy lines instead of straight lines when we're predicting where certain species might occur. And if you look really carefully at this plot, maybe Eric, if you can highlight it, there are some little black dots in this plot. And those are actually individual observations that the team made when they were out in the field. And then on top of that, you're seeing this kind of dark to white contour and coloration with these blue contour lines. Areas that are dark black are areas that we expect to see, in some cases, 80% less of these 4 indicator species compared to areas that are almost white, but not true white, kind of a very light gray. Those are areas in the reserve where we're predicting that we can actually observe, in some cases, 60% or 80% more of these 4 indicator species compared to other areas. And so this is actually a method that we can use as a program to statistically predict where where within the reserve we would observe not only individual species, but also certain cohorts of species. In this case, those 4 indicators that we talked about. And it might be a little hard to kind of, I almost wanted to superimpose an image of the reserve here, but essentially what you are seeing, Erica, if you can kind of highlight that contour in the mid left where it says 0.6, and it's kind of, yeah, right there. That is essentially very shallow habitat in the area between Rocky Point and Travis Spit. And what we're seeing is that generally for these 4 indicator species, they really do like this shallow habitat. And we see a similar thing happening west of Protection Island and then up onto Dallas Bank, and even all the way to the right, where generally speaking, these birds prefer shallow habitats, and they really actually very strongly, with the exception of 1 species, seem to avoid the channel entrance to Discovery Bay. That is that very dark black area that you see kind of in the center bottom right of this map. If you could go to the next slide. So we've started to address where the birds are occurring where these 4 indicator species are occurring within the reserve. But there's also the question, that's kind of an XY, right? There's also a Z component to this. What essentially depth strata did these 4 species tend to occur in? And so just like how a generalized additive model can help us address nonlinearity in spatial distribution, we can also do that with essentially the Z-axis. And I think Bob's team had the foresight that when they were on the boat and when they observed birds, they also wrote down the depth of water underneath the boat in feet. And so what you are seeing in this plot over on the right is for these 4 indicator species, when they were observed, what was the depth under the boat? And given that those birds were, about within 200 meters or so of the boat, these aren't exact depth estimates, but I would say they're pretty close because the bathymetry in that reserve, if you're in shallow water, you tend to be in shallow water. And if you're in deep water, you tend to be in deep water. There's some quite steep shelves out there. And really what we're seeing are 3 things that I'm going to highlight for you. If you see these humps, the first hump on the left-hand side of this plot, if Erica, you could scoot your cursor there. Yeah, right there. Essentially what this is showing us is that among these 4 species, there is a group of these birds that really prefers or tends to be observed in water that is about 50 feet in depth. And then the next hump is showing us that there is another group of these birds that tends to be observed more often than not in water that is about 150 feet in depth. And then given that we're only looking at 4 species, this gets a little wonky. The observations are those little black ticks on the bottom of the plot. You can see that those get a little sparse over as we go into deeper water. And so our confidence, our error bars increase around this line. But what you're seeing is kind of weak evidence, if you will, that there is also a group of birds among these 4 species that tend to really favor very, very deep habitats within the reserve when they were observed. And so if you go to the next slide, there we go. This is what these exact same plots look like when we incorporate all of the species in Bob's data. And so not only do we get better resolution in terms of light areas that birds prefer and dark areas that birds tend to avoid up on the top, but we also get much better resolution about the depth preferences of these birds. And so there's kind of a growing trend that there are lots of birds that tend to prefer essentially an area right around 150 feet in depth. There's also another population across all the species observed that tended to be observed in areas that were closer to about 250 feet in depth. And then I'm really curious about this. There's there's actually a very strong component of these observations of birds that seem to prefer really deep water out there around the 375-foot mark. And so this, to me, opens up some really interesting questions for our program about, why are the birds there? So Bob mentioned a little bit about like herring. There's also some really interesting life histories of many shrimp species within the reserve where when they're young and small, they tend to be in much shallower water and then they move deeper as they get older and larger. And yeah, so we have kind of a lot of open questions following this analysis in terms of what are the habitats and what are the food sources that are available at these 3 different depth strata. And then on the next slide, I think that's back to Bob. Yeah.
Okay, well, just from the biological point of view, some of the important takeaways that we came out of the whole study. So one is the importance of large alcids in the aquatic reserve. So murres, guillemots, and auklets are, the most abundant species there, among the most abundant species. And so, that's a group of birds that I'm not sure people really focused on enough in understanding in the eastern Strait of Juan de Fuca. These are really important species. Then the next is how important the period in the post-breeding season when we get this influx of common murres and California gulls through the Strait of Juan de Fuca. Uh, the third thing, and the opposite than what we thought, the lowest densities were actually during the nesting season, which was kind of counter to our original hypothesis. These feeding flocks that we were observing, part of our analysis is also looking at the feeding flocks, quantifying when they occurred and where they occurred. We don't have that here today, but it looked like these feeding flocks were almost always associated with forage fish, herring, and sand lance, and those predominated in certain years. 2019 seemed to be a very low year for feeding flocks compared to like 20 and going into 2021. We had lots of feeding flocks, but you saw in the data like the big spike of say rhinoceros auklets in the fall, the gulls in the fall, that those were largely associated with these feeding flocks. Dallas Bank, like Austin said, is where we have a thriving diving duck community, mostly made of surf scoters and white-winged scoters and long-tailed ducks. There are other species associated with them, but they're mostly going to the bottom, feeding on prey items that they're taking off the bottom, mollusks or crustaceans that they're getting off the bottom there. So Dallas Bank, and there are several other banks in the eastern Strait of Juan de Fuca that are also, you can be riding across on a boat to say the San Juan Islands, and you're crossing over shallow water, and all of a sudden there's a flock of white-winged scoters. So obviously these birds are concentrating out on those banks out in the eastern Strait of Juan de Fuca. Really interesting thing about marble and ancient murrelets. Marble murrelet, like Osman was saying, this is it's supposed to be a threatened species, even considered an endangered species. We have probably the healthiest population of marble murrelets in Washington State may be using the old growth forest in Olympic National Park. And so those birds at some point of their annual cycle are using these areas in Protection Island Aquatic Reserve. So that's an important thing to consider for endangered marble murrelets. The second to the bottom there, yellow-billed loons. Yellow-billed loon is considered the rarest of the typical expected loons in the Salish Sea. And we found that yellow-billed loons are using the aquatic reserve on a regular basis. They're there through each winter. And so we know spots now where we can predict we can go at basically any time outside the nesting season and find yellow-billed loons in the aquatic reserve. And so the last thing, we're still working on the final report. Sorry it's taken so long. There are too many distractions. And hey, I'm retired, so I have an excuse. So we're going to have a report coming up at some point, and thanks to Austin and his help, we have lots more to do. So thank you very much.
And then, yeah, just to kind of wrap things up here, essentially, I mean, just to reiterate what Bob said, like this was a great collaboration, and I think it shows what we as a program are hoping to do more of. So I really think that this demonstration in particular demonstrates how our program can work with motivated communities to not only fund or help fund citizen science on reserves, but also to support those projects with statistical analysis on the back end, and to really help leverage those data in kind of a bit of a self-serving way, but we're all in this because we care about the reserves, is to really help identify not only priority species for different reserves, but also habitats within those reserves. So Bertie talked a little bit about management plan updates in the past, and it is exactly kind of these sorts of partnerships and this sort of analysis that helps inform those management plan updates, and helps us do adaptive management, which is why we're here. So there are a lot of new research projects that are coming forward for the reserves, and these are going to create all sorts of opportunities for not only greater variety and breadth in the type of monitoring that we do on reserves, but also I think it'll help target some of the efforts that the community stewardship committees are doing, and also just build kind of closer collaboration with aquatic reserve staff, so that way we can ensure that there's really high quality stats being done on these data. We can help make sure and kind of give you all a platform to help share the data that you collect, and generally, just as I mentioned, incorporate more of the data that local experts are collecting in these sites, to help us do a better job with adaptive management. So thank you, Bob, for letting me take a stab at this data and continue to work on it with you. I think this is exactly what we want to do more of going forward.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks to you both. We're all clapping in our own little squares for you. We do have a few moments for questions, I think almost 15 minutes. So let's pile on these questions here. I see you can put them in the chat. You can ask them out loud, whatever you prefer. And I do see, Betsy, that you have a question already, or maybe something to add.
Well, mostly I just, oh, yeah, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
Mostly I just want to say thank you to Bob and Austin. I mean, they know that, we spent a lot of time collecting data, and as the person who does a citizen science coordination for the Marine Science Center, having backup statistical support is incredibly useful. I mean, it's just one of those pieces that is hard to find and hard to dig up. And I would also encourage, this is probably old news, but when you're creating this project, we created this based on some, Bob's background and some other inputs, but how do we analyze the data, and how do we plan for that? And is so critical in any of the, when we're creating all these, we as citizen scientists, like, we want to know more about this, and then that next step. So having somebody like Austin as a backup, back there for support is just invaluable. So thank you so much for that. That's great.
So I have a few questions, if I may. This is Lyle Anderson with the Cherry Point Aquatic Reserve. Once again, could you clarify why the 4 species, why you use those 4 species as indicator species?
Mostly because I am not an ornithologist. And so I basically taking a first stab, and that's really what you're seeing is a preliminary kind of first stab at this analysis, or at least on my part, I should say. Is because those have already been identified by the Puget Sound Partnership and by WDFW as broad indicators of ecosystem recovery across Puget Sound. And so kind of from a programmatic standpoint, that means that if we are, for example, seeing change in pitch and guillemot within the reserve, it gives us some legs to then try and ask for more resources to help steward the reserve, steward those birds within the reserve, or to steward the habitat that they rely on. And so I think there's a lot that can be said for also the analysis that Bob is doing, kind of a much broader analysis that brings his background as an ornithologist into it, because he has a much better understanding of the natural history of each of these species than I personally do. So that is why those 4 species were picked. Also, just because it's an enormous data set. I think Bob has something like 16,000 rows in this data set or something like that. And so, yeah, taking a first stab at it, I usually prefer to try and whittle it down to a few meaningful species, or at least species that I can assign meaning to through policy or through personal experience. You said you had a couple other questions.
Well, before your next question, Lyle, I want to point out too that Ron put in the chat a link to the Puget Sound Partnership's vital signs that you can look for more information about those specific species.
Ah, okay.
I'll go for
excellent.
it for any other questions.
Yeah. There have been major Puget Sound wide surveys in the past, like the Puget, like the Mesa survey and the Bower surveys. I'm sure you're familiar with those.
Yes.
Are there other surveys that have been that large that have occurred since like the Mesa surveys and the Bower surveys?
Yeah,
that
that's a
you
good
used
question. Yeah, and so we're referring back to those. There have been a number of local surveys. Also, WDFW has their things like their midwinter waterfowl survey, and they have other they have marble murrelet surveys. So there are other data sources, but like you say, Mesa, that's kind of this old historical data, and John Bauer doing his research there in Cherry Point. Those are all old data sets that we're using. Ours might be a little different because it was on a boat offshore and a replicate route that we were doing, regularly over a period of time. I wish we could have gone longer, but life got in the way. So, but yes, there are a number of other data sets that we need to compare with in our analysis.
Okay. I'm just amazed. The survey we do is just a very small land-based, basically using it as a baseline because the Aquatic Reserve contains 2 oil refineries, so it's more of a in case of a disaster of some sort. But yours is just, I'm really impressed. Wow. Thank you.
Well, we were really lucky to have a boat, and John or Ross Anderson, who was willing to take us out. Without his help, this wouldn't have been possible. So, and there's lots of, like the Puget Sound Seabird survey, which I'm sure you're familiar with, the same sort of thing. These are land-based surveys, and so you're using optics to try to see birds, out in the field. It's really different when you're out there in a boat and you're, amongst the birds. So, if you can possibly find a boat owner who'd be willing to help you out there to run some surveys, it's very interesting. We did some other surveys that I still have to look at. Is there were some times in the late season when we went from our aquatic reserve up to Smith Island, and we covered the Smith Island Aquatic Reserve up there. So we also have some data on that, some offshore data on that, but it's not complete.
Well, I look forward to your final report with all 57 species.
Yeah. Well, fortunately, there's only about maybe 15 or 18 or so that are numerical enough to make the analysis worthwhile.
We'll have to get you back out there. We'll have to find some more funding so we can get you back
Right.
on a boat.
Right.
All right. Any more questions for Bob or Austin?
Hi, it's Darla Smith. I don't know. I have my
Hi,
hand up,
Darla.
but I don't. Working. Just a quick observation. Working with Fidalgo Bay Aquatic Reserve and the Skagit MRC, we have a program that has about 365 trained volunteers right now that volunteer for about 60 organizations locally. And I just want to emphasize how important and valuable Austin Greene is. I mean, to be able to translate and interpret data, the number one question from any of these volunteers is, how is this data going to be used? It comes up over and over and over. They want to feel like their time is of value. So thank you, Austin Greene.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. I think all the way back to when I interviewed into this position, I think Birdie and Erica asked me, like, how do you feel about sharing data, in citizen science? And to me, at least, if people are spending their hours out on a boat, on a beach with optics, whatever it might be, like, I think as a program, we have a responsibility to really do as much as we can, which sometimes may be less than everyone hopes for, but nonetheless, like, to do what we can to try and turn that effort into reliable insight, and stats is the bridge that gets us there. So I'm happy to do that and happy to work with folks. I know there's kind of open questions about other data sets like intertidal monitoring and things like that. So we can chat about that during the roundtable if you want. But those are on my radar. So